And so finally, I want to touch on the post-war, that's the Second World War, the post-war period, and some of the changes that we see, including, for example, the formation of the United Nations. It is thought that the term United Nations was first used by the presidents of the US and the Prime Minister of Britain, that is FDR, and Winston Churchill when they met in the Atlantic Conference in 1841, but thereafter there'll be great references to the United Nations. But ultimately, the United Nations today, as we know it, represents an international organization, the premier international organization that brings together 193 countries as of 2024. And so if you look at the objectives, and so this is actually the preamble of the United Nations, and so you can sort of see it's probably improper to call it obsession, but the focus on peace. And so the preamble reading that to save, we the peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And so this is really one of the most significant purposes of the United Nations. Whether or not that has been achieved will be part of our discussions later on. But we see although fascism and supremacy nationalism had been defeated by the United Nations, we see the emergence of geopolitical differences where national interests, so the US and the USSR, the two major powers that emerged from the Second World War. Of course, the US followed the capitalist model and capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union was steeped in communism. But what we see is a mutual distrust, even though these countries had worked together during the Second World War to defeat Nazi Germany, even though the Soviet Union had actually been allied with Nazi Germany. It was not until the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union that we see the Soviet Union sort of come to the Allied side, and remember the whole Winston Churchill, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But so what we see is a number of elements of the Cold War. So for example, mutual suspicion, arms race, competing alliances, particularly NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, NATO, Western countries, Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union and its allies. Competition through proxy wars, and we can sort of think about this as globalized conflict, the Cold War in Asia and Africa, and so again, there were elements of indirect conflict. So the US at this time adopted what we call the policy of containment, and so before even containment, but maybe as part of the containment, the Truman Doctrine, where he argues that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. And really he was talking about Greece and Turkey facing the threat of falling to communism. We do see the emergence of concepts like the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, all others or those countries in the neighborhood might follow. And this is why we see, for example, the US actions in Korea and in Vietnam, North and South Vietnam. And so these differences were very significantly highlighted. But in terms of the challenges that these countries continue to face, for example, we see the Soviet Union obtain the bomb in 1949. Of course, the bomb was in part, the Soviet Union obtained the bomb through significant spying, and so this would also be part of the Cold War. You may be familiar with the movie Bridge of Spies that sort of highlights some of these contests. So the idea of containment was is often attributed to the telegram that was written by Mr. X, or Mr. X was George F. Kennan rather, writing, and he worked in the Soviet Union for the State Department, in which he argues that the USSR was aggressive, it had an uncompromising ideology, and it would only be stopped when it met unanswerable force. And so the idea that the US must adopt a policy of firm containment, an unalterable force to confront the Russians, so that perhaps there could be a peaceful world. Now, his article was written under the pseudonym of Mr. X and is often known as the Long Telegram, and I hope you might look it up and see. And so this is more text of in terms of what he thought containment should entail. And so he writes, it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. So even though there was, he acknowledges the Soviet Union talks about peace and love and so on, he characterizes those as abstract. And we do actually see, for example, the Soviet Union very invested in decolonization, but only to the extent that it might peel off those countries, but also to highlight the Western allies' hypocrisy of preaching democracy while either supporting or holding colonies, which, I mean, when you sort of think about it, was a black eye for most of Western countries in the US and its allies. So the article there, if you want to read it. Now, so the Cold War had certain elements like the arms race, and so the first and second strike weapons, which brought about this idea of mutually assured destruction, that if the US or the Soviet Union decided to utilize nuclear weapons, the other side would have enough weapons to cause annihilation. And so if you've ever watched the Terminator movies, kind of like that. But we see the development of alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has become revitalized in the last few, maybe 2 years, and Sweden and Finland joining. So again, we sort of think about the history, but history often repeats itself and extends to modernity. And so we can look at the Cold War as a series of proxy wars, ideological power plays that never came to hot wars, at least not between the US and the Soviet Union, even though there are places where they met on the battlefield. And so when you sort of think about the characteristics, you see military buildups, particularly soldiers and nuclear weapons, propaganda wars, and denigrating each other. So, for example, denigrating collectivism on the part of the democracies, but also the idea that democracy supported imperialism and lack of civil rights in the US. Unsuccessful negotiations, but there were often successful negotiations, for example, the Outer Space Treaty and so on. Ongoing conflict between capitalism in the global south, and communism rather, in the global south. So for example, Ethiopia, Somalia, Cuba, Angola, Vietnam and Korea, and sometimes the sides would change. The tightening of control in the spheres of influence. So for example, the protests in Berlin, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in the Eastern Hemisphere, and sort of what the Soviet Union did to quell them. But also, so this became the two major conflicts of this period. And so it's, I think it's useful to sort of think about this as the most emblematic of the Cold War. Now, it's useful to sort of think about what were proxy wars and perhaps what was not. And this is my characterization. So clearly the Vietnam War was a proxy war. The Afghanistan War probably was a proxy war, especially because the communist faction had taken government and the Soviet Union was supporting that. Now, soccer wars were not. The Ogaden War, there was a bit of switching sides between Ethiopia and Somalia. The South African border, or the Angolan War, was a proxy war. Now, the Yom Kippur and some of these other wars were not necessarily proxy wars, even though there was a lot of appealing to allies and the different sides. So, for example, a lot of Arab nations were supported by the Soviet Union, and of course, Israel was supported by the US and its allies. Even though, for example, during the Suez Crisis, the US was not very happy about what the French, British, and the Israelis were doing. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is often considered the most, perhaps the closest that the world came to nuclear annihilation, because the US, having seen Soviet missiles in Cuba, was really not trying to have missiles there. And so we shall discuss this in detail during the when we talk about conflicts. But also Vietnam was another of the major conflicts, and of course the US was involved there for about 20 years. Now, none of this became nuclear, except maybe Cuban Missile Crisis came close. But so again, there's the question of the involvement of the two major powers. Now, is it the case that the Cold War was that cold? Well, it was cold between the US and the Soviet Union, but in other places it was actually a bunch of hot wars. Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and so on. And during this period, you see about 40 million people die. And so, again, this isn't necessarily cold. In some places it was hot. Now, there were summits and treaties, and there were agreements. So, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that featured the US and the USSR. And so, again, this is maybe a win for global diplomacy. There was also, for example, the Glasgow Summit between the US and the USSR, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, which placed an absolute limit on ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and deployed nuclear warheads and multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs. But also, like when Nixon went to China, this was putting pressure on the Soviet Union, perhaps to see if there was possibilities of detente. And so even though the Cold War was continuing, there was opportunities, and actually frequently, of maybe reducing the Cold War. Of course, everyone remembers Reagan's 1986, 86, entreaty to Premier Gorbachev, tear down this wall and communism. But Mikhail Gorbachev was already doing some changes in the USSR. These were primarily known as glasnost and perestroika, but there had been other upheavals and other changes in Soviet foreign policy. But eventually we will see the end of the Cold War in 1991. Now, interestingly, the Western Alliance, for example, NATO didn't really change, but the Warsaw Pact really changed. We probably shall talk at some point about alignment and so on, non-aligned countries, but also non-aligned communist countries, which is kind of an anathema. And so Gorbachev is credited for glasnost and perestroika. And so eventual withdrawal, some say defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan, but also giving up control of Eastern European satellite countries like Poland, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. So sort of the end of the Cold War, even though China was still there. But the end of the Cold War did not necessarily bring about peace. In fact, we see, for example, more conflict and failed states. So, for example, Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, even though this had nothing to do with Cold War. But there was the question of now who was in charge and what were countries going to do in order to increase their own sense of importance and so on. We see, for example, Yugoslavia disintegrating into independent states. NATO remained, but it's almost like it had no purpose until maybe last 2022. But we also see widespread ethnic conflict in West Africa, Central Asia, parts of Central Africa, Indian subcontinent, the genocide in Rwanda, how can we forget that? And so the period after the Cold War was not necessarily one of peace. In fact, it was probably more conflict. And the US was now the hegemon, and it's sort of like, did it know what to do with itself? Probably not. Now, the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and we'll talk some more about this, have seen the rise of terrorism, Al-Qaeda networks, including actually like attacks in Kenya, in Tanzania, in other places, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. And the rise in the threat of weapons of mass destruction, terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia, Spain, Great Britain, economic devastation, financial crisis, the Arab Spring. And so when we actually look at this, is the world better off? Now, in the past few years, we have seen, so the past 20 years, we've seen, for example, Russia invading Ukraine, annexing Crimea, but also fighting in Georgia, the country, 2008. And so what does this mean? Because, for example, Russia claimed that it was going to save Russians who are in Ukraine and so on. But we also see, for example, the expansion of NATO, and so what does that portend? We see the rise of China, the Bridge and Road Initiative, but we also see populism like in the US and in Europe, and anti-immigration rhetoric and those kinds of things. Of course, 2020 to 2022-3 has been the COVID pandemic, and it's still probably not known what this will end or what collaborations it's going to bring about. But also in the past few years, we've seen, for example, the shutdown of the Malaysian Flight 17 with the killing of probably almost 200 Dutch citizens, the shutdown of a Ukrainian plane in Iran. And so it's not possible to actually say that the world is a more peaceful place just because in fact, there are those who rule the absence of the stability that the Cold War produced, because you kind of knew who the enemies were and who were not. And so, again, when we sort of think about the crises, the Ukrainian war, the crisis in Gaza, and the deaths that have been occasioned there, the march of authoritarianism over democracy. These are troubled times, but we shall talk some more about some of these elements in the coming days, and